When we left off the last video, I said this was pretty much apart. There's still a couple more things to do. There is a filter underneath this plate. Another troublesome gasket here. Remember, this is a plastic scraper. You don't want to damage anything in here. On the inside, you've got your screen filter, which is disgusting. Busy filter. Sealing washer. So this, by the way, is magnetic. That's why it's, you see it's attracting all sorts of gunk to it, which is a really good thing, because otherwise that would end up in the overdrive. Just make sure you get all the pieces out. There's also a sealing plate there at the bottom. And that's it for this side. While we're in here, one more piece we want to remove, which is the drain plug. The drain plug in mine is stuck. I couldn't get it out even with an impact, so I'm not going to keep pressing on it, because if I do, I'm just going to end up cracking the casing, and that'd be bad. I'm pretty confident I can call this drained, and for maintenance purposes, this is slightly lower than the rest of the case, but the filter's keeping most everything else out, and the drain plug in the bottom of the gearbox will do its job. I might try a little bit harder, but I'm going to do it off camera. But yeah. A good look there. This was inside of the overdrive. Kind of a good thing we're doing this. Look. We're going to continue some disassembly. This bearing carrier, you can see the bearings in there. You've got the housing is still kind of firmly stuck on this sliding member from the overdrive. So what we need to do is press this out or pull this off. You can't really get a press on it because there's not going to be room to get anything underneath. So what we're going to do instead, flat piece of metal, there's a little bit of room, and probably all we have to do is kind of get it started. We're going to take the shallower side, the bearing housing, because then there's a smaller distance for it to travel. Get it tightened up by hand. And there we go, see? Actually didn't take much force at all. Let's see if that's, no, not quite yet. Alright, to get it further, we're just going to put a socket in the middle. Looks like 1 1/8 is about perfect. And just do the same thing. Now you've pulled it off without damaging or bending anything. And by the way, on the other end of this, just for the film, we have this. Basically just fell off when I took it apart, but just so you're watching, you see that the piece is there. This bearing can now be pressed out. And here is your sliding member. This has got a dual clutch on both sides, and you want to make sure that there's no wear, no burn marks. If there's any question, you can usually get this on an exchange basis from a number of parts suppliers. They're not cheap, but again, being in the bowels of the Overdrive, you really don't want to have to do it more than once. So my suggestion is replace this. If you've gone this far, you might as well. Just make sure that it's a good quality part. I get the bearing out. We have this, it's an interior puller. You can also use a press for this, since by now you probably should have bought one, but just in case you haven't, you basically get the puller situated inside the bearing. And now it can't come out. And then this section is for pressing against the lower end. Make sure it's not on top of the bearing. See, so what'll happen is it'll pull on the bearing, it'll push against the housing, and you are tightening. There we go. The puller is pulling on the inside of the bearing while these two legs are pushing down as I'm tightening this. You don't want to use a hammer on this sort of thing. I guess you could get the bearing out, but even if you do, you're never going to get the new one in. There you have it. Alright, so the next step is to get this unidirectional clutch out. There's a circlip that holds it in. You can kind of see it. We're going to lever that out with a screwdriver. The brass ring comes out, and then as you pull it out, it'll come apart, but all of the roller bearings are going to fall out. Don't do this unless you're prepared to go through the pain in the butt of getting them back in. There's a trick with a rubber band. You kind of hold everything together and then press it in. So we'll show you that in a little bit, but that needs to come out. There's a bush in there that you can replace if you like. Then we are going to take out the speedometer drive gear. We'll pull the flange off the back. We'll kind of disassemble this again for cleaning. Place some bearings in here as well, and well, a bearing in here as well. And then we should be pretty close to reassembly once everything's clean. So let's get to it. Always be careful these don't go flying. And speaking of going flying, this will, all of the bits will drop out here, so just be careful. Not lose any of these rollers. Now is a good time to check the condition of your bearing surface. And you'll also want to look at the end of the main shaft on your gearbox, because that'll give you a good idea. If it's chewed up, then you know, obviously you'll have replaced the main shaft, but a new bearing would also be in order. Otherwise it might be okay. Some versions of this may have a roller bearing, and if you've got the kind of a needle bearing, you'll want to pry that out. Get a new one. Obviously get a new one first before you go prying the old one out. Let's get this stuff out of the way and we'll continue. Okay, to get the speedometer drive gear out, there is a bolt that keeps it from coming out on its own. I'll take that out. And then the trick is to get an old cable to protect the threads. Now I like to get something to wedge against. And then you should be able to just pry it out with a screwdriver. Didn't say it'd be easy, but there you go. It sticks a little bit because of the O-ring, which you should get a new one of for replacement. There's the speedometer drive gear, and there we go. So that's an O-ring we want to replace. You probably pick one up at a hardware store. You don't need a special kit for that. But if it's leaking, go ahead and replace that, or even if it's not, it's an O-ring. They're cheap. Okay, set that aside. Okay, now the tail shaft comes out. There is a cotter pin in here that you'll need to get out. If you're very careful like that, you've got a perfectly usable cotter pin. Seriously, do not do that. Just toss it. You need a socket. This is a 1 1/8. And then all that's left is to drift this out. I have a brass drift here so that I don't damage anything. Okay, and then you'll need a couple of pieces of wood. Just under the edges, you want to make sure there's enough room for the innards to fall out. Tail shaft. Inside you've got an outer bearing. There's a spacer piece, you can kind of see it moving around in there. There's another bearing, and then the oil seal. All of these should come out, but the two bearings are pressed in, the seal needs to come out, and there's not a good way to get leverage on that. So here's what we're going to do. If you move the spacer pieces to the side, then you can get a drift and tap on just the bearing so that the bearing falls out. Before you do this, again, make sure you have another bearing, that you can order one. If you can't, that's going to be a problem. And you want to go one side and then the other. Bearing, a couple of spacers. Well, technically one of these is a spacer, the other one's the speedometer drive gear. Should be obvious which one's which, and then one more bearing and a seal. Okay, don't put it in too hard, but you can get it held in a vise so you can get more leverage on it. That's better. Our seal. Okay, and finally there's one more bearing to get out after the seal is out of the way. That's this guy here. Goes out through the top, and I have a bearing and seal driver. This happens to be just the right size to fit down in there, so that I can get my hands out of the way. A couple good whacks. Oops. There. There's the rear bearing. There is nothing else in here, so we've got a chance to clean all this up. It's a tail shaft, and we've got a spacer, a little washer in the middle, speedometer drive gear. This is the annulus. A little bush inside there, if you care to renew that. Get all the gunk out of the way, make sure that it's cleaned up. We've got some crap in there. So, two bearings, those I've got on order, those will both be replaced. And then here's the rest of it. We've got the main casing, the screen filter, that's still got some crap in it. I'll finish washing that out. The sliding member that is going to be renewed. I've got a new bearing here. Planetary gears. What you want to do is make sure that there's not excessive play. Look for worn or chipped teeth. Not really seeing anything that's a problem. Am I? No. It's just a speck of dirt. Obviously, we'll get this all good and cleaned up so that we can get a really good look at it. Brake ring, that just needs to be cleaned. The sun gear, again, same thing. Make sure there's no chipped teeth. You don't have excessive wear or anything that just looks out of the ordinary on it. 4 springs, it's a good idea to get new ones of those. What happens with the 4 springs, let's see if I can remember which way this goes. The 4 springs will force this, the clutch lining here, against the annulus. And so that gets forced into place by the springs, and then the hydraulic pressure, there's 2 pistons that will push on bridge pieces, the carrier, that forces it the other way. But it's the springs that hold it back. And so if those springs aren't strong enough, you're going to have problems with the overdrive operating correctly. And so it's just a good idea to get those replaced. Again, you get more solid connection. This will last longer too. So again, that bearing's going to be replaced, and that's pretty much it. Outside of that, we're ready to reassemble. Okay guys, that's it for this video. So next step is to get everything cleaned up, inspect everything. One thing I didn't mention, the spring on that oil pump should have a free length of at least 2 inches. If it doesn't, you need to throw out that spring and get a new one. But same kind of deal. Go through, check the specs on all the parts, make sure that you have enough lining on the clutch pieces, make sure that there aren't any O-rings that are worn or that need to be replaced because they got too hard. Get new bearings. You've gotten to this point, you may as well do that. And then after that, we're going to reassemble everything. We'll remate it to the transmission, and then we're good to go. We'll get it back in the car. So please subscribe to the channel. It does help. You'll get an alert, and it'll be easier to find the other videos, so you can kind of have everything in one place. If you've got questions, post them in the comments below. We're happy to chat. Thanks.